Welcome to Because You Asked. I'm Barry Nussbaum. We are back from our tour of Israel, and today's special guest is Danny Seaman. 30 years serving the government of Israel, including 6 prime ministers. He's known around the world as the voice of the Prime Minister of Israel, including a decade serving Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. In segment 1, we are going to hear about his background, how he became what he was, known to the world as the voice of Israel. Danny, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us just a little bit of bio. You've got a fascinating history of government work for, as you said, a number of prime ministers. I'd like to hear about it.
I started working for Israeli government about 34 years ago. I worked at the Israeli consulate in New York.
So you started it when you were 8?
Something like that. No, I was just out of the army. I was 23 years old. I began working for the Israeli government at that time on campuses in the United States. It was difficult even then. It's gotten worse over the years. And came back to Israel, started working with the government press office. It's the branch of the Prime Minister's office that works with the foreign press. I started out working with Yitzhak Shamir at his time. Worked with Yitzhak Rabin after that. I left at that period. I felt uncomfortable. I didn't support what was going on in the peace process. Maybe we'll talk about this later. Worked with the IDF Spokesman's Unit. It's the branch of the IDF that works with the foreign press. And then I came back under Netanyahu. I worked with him in his first term. I worked with Barak, and then Ariel Sharon. And I was appointed under Barak as the director of the government press office, and retired about 3 years ago.
So incredible. In the United States, you get to work with one president. In Israel, at least in your biography, you've worked with the most recent history of 25 years. It's fascinating.
Well, we were built on the British model, that you have professional civil servants. So I was a professional civil servant. Like I said, when I felt uncomfortable, being an American, not a lot of Israelis do that, but being an American, when I felt uncomfortable with what I saw was happening or not happening with the peace process, I didn't feel that I could support or defend that. So I left the position.
Got it.
I worked with the IDF Spokesman's Unit. I re-enlisted and was an officer with the IDF and worked there with the foreign press. It was easier because I didn't have to defend policy. Just had to deal with the things happening with the IDF. So came back when I felt more comfortable with the government and worked through several prime ministers after that.
So, who's your favorite?
Who's my favorite? Menachem Begin. Unfortunately, I didn't get to work with him personally, but it was a standard of a prime minister that
because of his warrior mentality, his leadership, his personality?
Maybe it's because I was younger. I was drawn to him because of his charisma, because of his very staunch, strong Zionist identity. He was a man of the people, and so being a young man, I was drawn to him and to the Likud at that time. But I found that it was very interesting with every prime minister. There was something interesting about them. I knew Netanyahu from the time I worked at the consulate in New York, so I knew him personally for many years. Sharon was very surprising. I had known him as a military figure, admired him. One of the reasons I was a paratrooper, I joined because of Ariel Sharon and his record. And I told him this when he was prime minister. One of our roles was to take the picture, the official photo of the prime minister. So obviously I had to be at that. And I shook his hand afterwards and I spoke to him, and he was so pleasant and such a different than his public persona.
So he's not a bulldozer in private?
Not at all. Sharon was perhaps the most surprising. He is very kind and very generous person. I also worked for Olmert, who I had known his brother. I worked very closely with his brother before, so I knew him for many years. So working in government for a lot of, you get to know these people personally on many different levels. But to say a particular person that, there were good things and bad things about all of them.
So what's Bibi like to work for?
Bibi, he's, how do I put this in a way that doesn't, I don't mean to in any way speak ill of him. He's very single-minded in working for Israel, whereas Olmert or Sharon would be, they had their people working for them. They were very strong with the people surrounding them. Some people think that Bibi doesn't care because he's very focused on the role. Some people may call it Machiavellian. I think there's something good about it because he doesn't deal with nonsense. He's very focused on what he has to get done as prime minister, also for preserving himself. But he is extremely bright. Extremely bright. I think we've been blessed in Israel with having, putting all criticisms aside, political criticisms, Barak, Olmert, Netanyahu, Sharon, very, very bright individuals. I think that we've been very blessed in Israel with having leadership that understand the role. Sometimes it was funny, I would see when prime ministers are replaced or the person elected comes into office. And we're all there in the office receiving the new prime ministers, and they go in for about an hour or two, they sit with the former prime minister, and you see their face before they go in, they're full of confidence, and they come in, they've just been elected, they have all, and then you see them when they leave. They're coming out.
They've heard all the problems?
Oh my God, you see their face, and I said, oh, what did he hear that we don't know about yet?
Right.
And they say that the most difficult job in the world is being prime minister of the state of Israel, because you basically have any decision of yours can cost, and we are perhaps the only country in the world that its destiny is questioned. And there are those forces out there who want to destroy us. So politics is nice, and running for politics and being elected, I think they understand, but there comes that point, and it may have been somebody who served as Minister of Defense. The moment you're sitting there and you are the one who makes the decisions, I think the full weight of the responsibility of 3,000, 4,000 years of history is lying on their shoulders. The moment they understand that, they say, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right.
I also say that who knows what phone call they got from the United States at that moment. We have this stuff on you. You better start doing what we're saying. I'm saying that facetiously, but I think every one of the prime ministers have this understanding of the responsibility that they have as the leaders of the Jewish people, and it's comforting to know that. But if going back to your question about Netanyahu, I think he is the sharpest. He is. Some call him a chess player, that he's always thinking several steps ahead. You knew when you're sitting in a meeting with him, I knew him for many years, as I said. I knew I didn't have to go into long explanations. Tell him what you saw, tell him what you think, he'll understand it at that point. And his mind is thinking several steps ahead. So with Netanyahu, it's actually, I enjoyed working with him on that because he didn't have to go into all these explanations of why you saw something in my arena, which was public relations. It's very easy. He said, Mr. Prime Minister, this and this is the things that we saw. I think we can do this. And he just gives you the okay because he's already understood where you want to go with it.
Got it. So let's talk about one of the important roles that you've had, and it's a corollary to what we're dealing with in the United States. Just this morning, President Trump was talking about fake news that had been released on supposedly his desire to greatly increase the nuclear capability of the United States. It's a big thing with our president in the U.S. to deal with the fake news sources and what to do about it. Now, you've had that experience as well, right?
Well, I basically say that people call this the cradle of the civilization. This is the cradle also of fake news.
Israel is.
The Middle East, but particularly Israel, because in the second half of the 80s, and especially in the 90s, Israel became the focus and the center of international media. There were more journalists here per capita than any place else in the world, and sometimes more journalists than any place else when you had events going on here. It was even overcovered, because when you have, I would say after the 73 war, but especially, we're talking 40 years now, Sadat coming to Israel, and it sort of changed the Middle East at that point. Israel became a focus point for the foreign press. It was very central before that, but it really became the place. They've been centered in Beirut before that, but after, if you remember, journalists were abducted by Hezbollah and by Muslims in the 80s in Beirut, suddenly journalists understood that it's not a comfortable place to be. And they moved to Israel. Israel's very convenient. It has access to every place. It's a Western society, very sophisticated, very modern. Even back 30 years ago, we were more modern than the other areas. So Germans felt this is a good place to hang out at. Now, if they could be here and then hop to Syria or to Cairo or to other places, very quickly the story became here in Israel. They could sit in Tel Aviv at a bar and get in a cab, and an hour and a half later be in the territories. Well, by the 90s, they could sit in the bar and they'd be part of the story because bars and restaurants were targeted at that time by terrorists. So it's very convenient. But then if you have this many journalists here for so long, and they all want to have certain angle, a special angle. How many times can you cover the story here and get something that's unique and special? Now, we have a lot of stories. If you've been here, if you've been to Israel, you know that it's constantly reinventing itself. But a journalist who's been here for a few years and there's a lot of competition, so they would stretch the truth at times. Now, stretching the truth is one thing, but when it became, and this is the year 2000, I think at 93, when the peace process began with the Oslo process, the story sort of shifted from being the story about Israel, the return of the Jewish people to the Holy Land, to its ancient homeland. It sort of shifted to the Palestinians because they were nation building supposedly at that time. And the journalists spent more time with the Palestinians and in the Palestinian areas. Unfortunately, it was like they were embedded. And one of the concepts, this was a concept that the American military developed during the first Gulf War. They understood that when you have journalists embedded with soldiers, the soldiers aren't just this faceless, nameless troops moving in. They're now Billy Bob and Billy Jane and people that they know, and they know their families, and they become close to them. This also happened with the Palestinians. Now, up until 2000, it was okay. But the moment that the Palestinians went to war against Israel, their so-called, or as the media, the watered-down term, called it an intifada, at that point, they became tools and were being used by the Arabs and by the so-called Palestinians.
Danny, thank you so much.
Thank
This
you.
has been a real distinct pleasure. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Fascinating insight from Danny Seaman. Thanks for joining us on Because You Asked. You can always write to me at barry@americantruthproject.org. I promise to get back to you. And you can go to our website, americantruthproject.org, where you can sign up to be on our mailing list. It's always free, and you'll never miss an exciting episode. I'm Barry Nussbaum.